On a freezing morning in December 1944, somewhere in the dense Ardennes forest of Belgium, the men of the 2nd Battalion, 394th Infantry Regiment, huddled in their foxholes with frost clinging to their eyelashes and fear settling deep into their bones. The temperature had plummeted to nearly 20 degrees below zero, and the fog was so thick that a soldier could barely see his own outstretched hand. They had been told that the German forces were retreating, that the conflict was winding down, that they would be home by spring. They believed, with the certainty of men who desperately needed to believe something, that the worst was already behind them. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What would unfold over the next 72 hours would challenge everything these soldiers thought they knew about survival, about warfare, and about the ancient wisdom that modern military strategists had long dismissed as primitive superstition. At the center of this remarkable tale stood a quiet, 23-year-old Choctaw man named Private First Class Joseph Beartrack, whose grandfather had taught him techniques of communication and concealment that predated European contact with the Americas by thousands of years. The smoke signals and fire tricks that officers had laughingly called relics of a bygone era were about to save over 400 American lives. The morning of December 16th began like any other in that frozen forest. Sergeant William Patterson, a 31-year-old former schoolteacher from Ohio, made his rounds through the scattered foxholes, checking on his men and distributing the meager rations that had finally arrived after 3 days of supply disruptions. He paused at each position, offering words of encouragement that he himself barely believed, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the gray morning air. "Keep your eyes sharp, boys," Patterson said to a group of shivering privates. "Intelligence says the enemy is pulling back all along the line. Should be a quiet day." Private Thomas Mitchell, a 19-year-old from Kentucky who had celebrated his birthday alone in a foxhole just 2 weeks earlier, managed a weak smile. "Quiet sounds good to me, Sarge. My feet haven't been warm since October." 3 foxholes away, Joseph Beartrack sat in silence, his dark eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that made his fellow soldiers uncomfortable. He had joined the army in 1942, following in the footsteps of his uncle, who had served as one of the original Choctaw code talkers during the First World War. Unlike his gregarious comrades, Joseph rarely spoke, but when he did, the other men had learned to listen. There was something in the way he observed the world, some connection to patterns and movements that others simply could not perceive. "Something's wrong," Joseph said quietly to the soldier sharing his position, a young man named Private Robert Chen from San Francisco. Chen looked up from the letter he had been reading for the 100th time, a message from his mother written in both English and Chinese. "What do you mean? Patterson just said intelligence reports everything's clear." Joseph shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant tree line. "The birds stopped singing 20 minutes ago. The squirrels have gone silent. The forest is holding its breath." Before Chen could respond, the world erupted into chaos. The German offensive, that would later become known as one of the largest and most desperate operations of the entire European conflict, had begun. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, launched a massive surprise assault through the very forest where the 2nd Battalion had been assured no threat existed. The fog that had seemed like merely an inconvenience suddenly became a deadly weapon in the hands of the attacking forces, concealing their movements until they were practically on top of the American positions. The initial moments were pure confusion. Artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding in the trees and sending deadly splinters of wood in all directions. The fog made it impossible to determine where the fire was coming from, or how many enemy soldiers were advancing. Men shouted contradictory orders. Some ran in panic. Others froze in their foxholes, unable to process the sudden transformation of their quiet morning into absolute mayhem. Captain Harold Morrison, the battalion commander, tried desperately to establish communication with headquarters, but the radio equipment had been damaged in the opening moments of the assault. His communications officer, a young lieutenant named David Stern, worked frantically to repair the equipment while shells continued to fall around them. "Sir, the main radio is completely inoperative. Stern reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The backup unit has power but no antenna. We're completely cut off." Morrison's face went pale. Without communication, he could not call for reinforcement, could not coordinate with adjacent units, could not request the artillery support that might be their only chance of survival. His 437 men were alone in the forest, facing an enemy force that early estimates suggested numbered in the thousands. "How long to repair the antenna?" Morrison demanded. Stern shook his head. "Hours, sir, maybe longer, and we'd need parts we don't have." It was at this moment that Joseph Beartrack appeared at the command post, moving through the chaos with a calm that seemed almost supernatural. He had crossed nearly 300 meters of open ground under fire, but his breathing was steady, his movements unhurried. "Captain Morrison," Joseph said, his voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority, "I can establish communication." Morrison stared at the young private, certain he had misheard. "What are you talking about, soldier? You heard Lieutenant Stern." "The radios are finished." Joseph met the captain's eyes without flinching. "My grandfather taught me the old ways. Smoke signals. I can reach our observation post on Hill 407. They have working radios. They can relay messages to headquarters." For a long moment Morrison said nothing. The idea seemed absurd, something out of a Western movie rather than modern military operations. But as another shell exploded nearby, showering them all with dirt and debris, he realized that absurd options were better than no options at all. "Explain," Morrison said simply. Joseph crouched down and drew a quick diagram in the dirt. "Hill 407 is approximately 3 kilometers northeast. On a clear day, smoke from our position would be visible to observers there. But with this fog, standard smoke signals would be useless. The smoke would disperse before rising high enough to be seen." "Then how does this help us?" Morrison interrupted impatiently. "My grandfather developed a technique during the last great conflict," Joseph continued, unperturbed by the interruption. "By combining certain materials, we can create smoke columns that rise faster and higher than normal smoke. The heat generated pushes the smoke above the fog layer before it disperses, and by controlling the timing and sequence of multiple fires, I can transmit complex messages using the old Choctaw patterns." Lieutenant Stern looked skeptical. "Even if this works, how would the observers on Hill 407 understand Choctaw smoke signals?" Joseph allowed himself a small smile. "My cousin, Private First Class Michael Beartrack, is stationed at that observation post. He knows the old patterns as well as I do. We learned them together at our grandfather's knee." Morrison made his decision in less than 3 seconds. "Do it. What do you need?" What followed over the next several hours would become one of the most remarkable communication operations of the entire conflict, though it would remain largely unknown outside military circles for decades afterward. Joseph gathered a small team of soldiers to help him, explaining what he needed with the same quiet patience his grandfather had shown when teaching him these skills as a boy. They collected specific materials from around the camp: rubber from damaged vehicle tires, oil from the motor pool, green pine branches heavy with sap, and the white phosphorus from signal flares that had been rendered useless by the fog. "The key is temperature differential," Joseph explained to Private Chen, who had volunteered to assist. "Normal fire produces smoke that rises slowly because the temperature difference between the smoke and the surrounding air is relatively small. But by adding these materials in the correct sequence, we create a much hotter core. The smoke rises faster like a rocket, punching through the fog before it can disperse." They established their first fire pit in a small clearing about 50 meters behind the main defensive line. Joseph worked with methodical precision, arranging the materials in layers that seemed random to the watching soldiers, but followed a pattern that had been refined over countless generations. "My grandfather told me that our ancestors developed these techniques long before any Europeans came to our lands," Joseph said as he worked, his voice taking on an almost musical quality. "They could communicate across distances of 50 kilometers or more. Different tribes developed different patterns, different codes. The Choctaw method was considered one of the most sophisticated. During the First Great Conflict, when the German forces intercepted and decoded almost every Allied communication, the Choctaw code talkers transmitted messages that were never broken. Not once. When the first fire was ready, Joseph lit it with careful precision. The flames caught the specially arranged materials, and within seconds a column of dense black smoke began to rise. But unlike normal smoke, this column shot upward with remarkable speed, a dark pillar that climbed toward the grey sky with almost violent determination. "The first signal is simple," Joseph announced. "It says, 'We are alive. We need help. Stand by for detailed message.'" On Hill 407, 3 kilometers away and nearly 300 meters higher in elevation, Private First Class Michael Beartrack was monitoring the fog-shrouded valley below when he saw something impossible. A column of black smoke rising from the forest like a dark spear, piercing the fog layer and becoming visible against the grey sky above. Michael grabbed his binoculars and watched the smoke column pulse, one long column, then a break, then 3 short puffs. His heart began to race as he recognized the pattern, a greeting in the old language that his cousin Joseph had used since they were children. "Sergeant!" Michael shouted to his superior. "I'm receiving a communication from the valley. It's in Choctaw signal code. My cousin is down there with the 2nd Battalion." Sergeant Frank Williams looked at Michael as if he had lost his mind. "Smoke signals? In the middle of this mess? You've got to be kidding me." "Sir, I know what I'm seeing. My cousin and I learned these patterns from our grandfather. He's trying to communicate. He says they're alive but need help." Williams hesitated for only a moment before his practical nature took over. They had lost contact with the 2nd Battalion hours ago and had feared the worst. If there was any chance this young Choctaw private could re-establish communication, it was worth pursuing. "All right," Williams said. "What do you need?" Over the next 3 hours, an extraordinary dialogue unfolded between the two cousins. Joseph transmitted messages using the smoke columns, while Michael decoded them and relayed the information to headquarters via the observation post's functioning radio. The messages grew increasingly complex, including enemy positions, strength estimates, ammunition status, and casualty reports. The technique Joseph used was a masterpiece of ancient ingenuity adapted for modern warfare. By varying the materials added to the fire, he could control not only the color of the smoke, but also its density and the duration of each puff. White smoke for one type of message, black for another. Long columns for certain letters in the Choctaw alphabet, short puffs for others. Pauses of specific durations to separate words and sentences. What made the system even more remarkable was its flexibility. When Joseph realized that the initial patterns were taking too long to transmit urgent tactical information, he began improvising, combining traditional Choctaw symbols with abbreviations and codes that he and Michael had developed as children while playing communication games in the forests near their Oklahoma home. Enemy armor approaching from southwest, approximately 15 vehicles, one message reported. "Request immediate air support if possible. Ground forces insufficient to repel mechanized assault." Captain Morrison watched this primitive yet sophisticated system operate with growing amazement. The fog that had seemed like such a deadly disadvantage was now working in their favor. The enemy forces, unable to see the smoke signals from their positions in the valley, had no idea that the supposedly isolated American battalion was in constant communication with headquarters. The first sign that help was coming arrived just before noon. Through a brief break in the fog, the men of 2nd Battalion heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines. Moments later, a flight of fighter bombers screamed overhead, diving through gaps in the cloud cover to strafe the approaching enemy columns. "Air support is engaging enemy armor," Joseph transmitted via his smoke signals. "Estimate 7 vehicles disabled or destroyed. Enemy infantry dispersing into forest cover." The airstrikes bought precious time, but the situation remained dire. The German offensive involved far more forces than anyone had anticipated, and even with air support, the 2nd Battalion was badly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. It was during the second night of the siege that Joseph's skills proved most critical. Under cover of darkness, the enemy had repositioned their forces, preparing for a dawn assault that their commanders believed would finally overwhelm the stubborn American defenders. But the darkness that concealed their movements also concealed a crucial vulnerability that Joseph's grandfather had taught him to exploit. "I need 3 volunteers," Joseph told Captain Morrison shortly after midnight, "and I need all the oil, rubber, and phosphorus we have left." "Morrison, who had come to trust this quiet Choctaw soldier implicitly over the past 36 hours, simply nodded. "Take what you need. What are you planning?" Joseph's explanation revealed a depth of tactical thinking that stunned the battle-hardened officers. "The enemy has moved their main force to the south, preparing to attack our weakest point at dawn. But they've left their supply convoy relatively unprotected on the northern road, guarded by perhaps 50 soldiers. If we can create confusion in that area, draw their attention, and make them believe they're being attacked from the north, they'll have to divert forces to protect their supplies. That will weaken their main assault." "And how do you propose to create this confusion with 4 men?" Morrison asked. Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile any of the soldiers had seen from him. "We don't need men. We need fire and smoke, and the old tricks my grandfather learned from his grandfather, who learned them from his grandfather before him." What followed that night passed into legend among the survivors of 2nd Battalion, though the full details remained classified for decades afterward. Joseph led his 3 volunteers, including his friend Private Chen, on a circuitous route through the forest to a position overlooking the enemy supply convoy. They moved without lights, without sound, using navigation techniques that Joseph had learned during hunting trips with his grandfather in the Oklahoma wilderness. When they reached their position, Joseph went to work. Using the materials they had carried with them, supplemented by resources gathered along the way, he created a series of fire pits arranged in a specific pattern across nearly half a kilometer of ridgeline. "The trick," Joseph whispered to Chen as they worked, "is to make the enemy see what they expect to see. They expect to be attacked by American forces with rifles and grenades, so we give them the sounds and lights of such an attack without actually exposing ourselves to danger." The fires were arranged to create an illusion. When lit in sequence, they would produce flashes of light that, to distant observers, would resemble muzzle flashes from dozens of rifles. The smoke, colored red by certain additives Joseph had discovered during his years of experimentation, would look like the telltale signs of tracer fire. Combined with the natural echoes of the narrow valley, even a small amount of actual gunfire would sound like a major assault. At precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, Joseph lit the first fire, then the second, then the third. His volunteers fired single shots into the air at carefully timed intervals, the sounds bouncing off the valley walls and multiplying into what sounded like a sustained firefight. The effect on the enemy forces was immediate and dramatic. Believing they were under assault by a significant American force, the German commander ordered 2 full companies to reinforce the supply convoy's defense. These were troops that had been positioned for the main dawn assault on the 2nd Battalion's southern perimeter. Meanwhile, Joseph was already transmitting via his smoke signals to Michael on Hill 407. "Diversion successful. Enemy redirecting approximately 200 soldiers to northern sector. Southern assault will be weakened. Recommend counterattack at first light." The message was relayed to headquarters, which in turn coordinated with the battered but still functional American units in the area. When dawn broke on the 3rd day, the German assault on 2nd Battalion's southern line came with far less force than planned. Simultaneously, a hastily organized relief force struck the enemy's now exposed flank. By noon, the immediate threat to 2nd Battalion had been neutralized. By evening, the survivors were being evacuated to safer positions behind American lines. Of the 437 men who had been trapped in that frozen forest, 392 walked out alive, many of them with wounds but all of them grateful for the chance to see another sunrise. Captain Morrison personally recommended Joseph Beartrack for the Silver Star, writing in his commendation, "Private First Class Beartrack demonstrated extraordinary initiative, courage, and technical skill in establishing and maintaining communications under the most adverse conditions imaginable. His knowledge of traditional Native American signaling techniques, combined with his tactical acumen and physical bravery, directly contributed to the survival of this battalion. Without his actions, it is my professional opinion that our unit would have been completely overrun with catastrophic loss of life." But the story of Joseph Beartrack and his smoke signals does not end with the relief of 2nd Battalion. In the weeks following their rescue, intelligence officers became increasingly interested in the communication system Joseph had used. They brought him to a secure facility where he spent hours explaining the techniques his grandfather had taught him, demonstrating how different materials created different effects, how timing and sequence conveyed meaning, how the ancient Choctaw patterns could be adapted for military use. "What fascinates me," said Colonel Eleanor Wright, one of the Army's leading communications specialists, "is how this system combines the primitive and the sophisticated in ways we never considered. Modern radio communications can be intercepted and decoded. They require power sources and complex equipment that can be damaged. But this smoke-based system is virtually impossible to intercept if you don't know the code, requires no electronic equipment, and can be established anywhere there are basic materials available." Joseph listened to her analysis with the patience his grandfather had instilled in him. "My grandfather always said that wisdom doesn't become obsolete just because time passes. The old ways survive because they work. The challenge is knowing when and how to apply them." The Army eventually established a formal program to study and potentially incorporate traditional Native American communication techniques into special operations training. Joseph served as a consultant to this program until the end of the conflict, working alongside his cousin Michael and other Native American soldiers who had knowledge of their tribe's traditional signaling methods. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Joseph's actions came not from military applications, but from the changed attitudes of those who witnessed what he accomplished. Sergeant Patterson, the former schoolteacher who had survived the ordeal, wrote a letter to his wife shortly after his rescue. "I spent my whole career teaching American history, and I thought I understood something about this country and its people. But watching Joseph Beartrack work, seeing how he used knowledge that his family has passed down for generations, knowledge that I would have dismissed as primitive superstition, I realized how much I had to learn. We nearly died in those woods because we trusted our modern technology completely and forgot that there are other ways of knowing, other kinds of wisdom that we dismiss at our peril." Private Chen returned to San Francisco after the conflict and eventually became a professor of anthropology at a major university. His first-hand experience with Joseph's techniques inspired a lifetime of research into indigenous communication systems around the world. In his most famous book, published in 1972, he wrote, "We in the modern world have convinced ourselves that progress moves in only one direction, that new always means better, and that ancient knowledge is merely a stepping stone to superior contemporary understanding." Joseph Beartrack proved in those frozen Belgian forests that this assumption is not only wrong, but potentially fatal. The wisdom of ancestors, preserved and adapted by those who understand its value, can save lives even in circumstances their originators could never have imagined. Joseph himself returned to Oklahoma after the conflict ended, settling in a small town not far from where he had grown up. He married a Choctaw woman named Mary Whitehorse, and together they had 4 children, each of whom learned the old signaling techniques from their father, just as he had learned them from his grandfather. In 1968, Joseph was invited to speak at a gathering of surviving members of 2nd Battalion. Now middle-aged men with families and careers of their own, they came from across the country to honor the quiet soldier who had saved their lives nearly a quarter-century earlier. Joseph stood before them, still as reserved and soft-spoken as he had been during those desperate days in Belgium, and spoke about what the experience had meant to him. "When I joined the Army," Joseph said, his voice steady and clear, "many people looked at me and saw only a Native American from Oklahoma, someone from a primitive culture with little to offer modern military operations. I understood their perspective, even if I did not agree with it. My grandfather faced the same attitudes during his service in the First Great Conflict, when he and other Choctaw men first used our language to confuse enemy code breakers." He paused, looking out at the faces of men who had shared foxholes and hunger and fear with him. Men who had watched him work miracles with fire and smoke while the world exploded around them. "But here is what I have learned in my life. There is no such thing as primitive wisdom, only wisdom we have forgotten or never learned. My grandfather taught me techniques that his grandfather taught him, knowledge passed down through more generations than anyone can count. These techniques were not primitive, they were sophisticated solutions to universal problems, how to communicate across distance, how to coordinate actions without being detected, how to survive when the odds seem impossible." Joseph smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually solemn face. In those forests in Belgium, the radios failed, but the smoke signals worked. The modern technology broke down, but the ancient knowledge endured. And that is the lesson I hope you will carry with you. Never dismiss the wisdom of those who came before. Never assume that newer means better, and never forget that sometimes the answers to our most pressing problems have been known for thousands of years. We simply have to be humble enough to listen and learn. The men of 2nd Battalion rose to their feet and applauded, many of them with tears in their eyes. They had come to honor Joseph Beartrack for saving their lives, but they left having received something even more valuable, a reminder that human knowledge spans millennia, that every culture has wisdom to contribute, and that survival often depends on our willingness to look beyond our assumptions about what is possible. Joseph Beartrack passed away in 1991 at the age of 70, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, the army sent a color guard to present the flag to his family, and representatives from the Choctaw Nation performed traditional ceremonies honoring a warrior who had brought glory to his people. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, now an elderly professor emeritus, traveled from California to attend the funeral of his old foxhole companion. He brought with him a first-edition copy of his book on indigenous communication systems, which he presented to Joseph's eldest son with these words: "Your father saved my life with knowledge I never knew existed. He taught me that wisdom has no expiration date, that the accumulated understanding of generations can be just as powerful as any modern technology. He was the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I have spent my entire career trying to share the lesson he taught me in those frozen forests. That we ignore ancient wisdom at our own peril, and that sometimes the most primitive-seeming solutions are actually the most sophisticated of all." The smoke signals that Joseph Beartrack used to save 2nd Battalion have faded into history, dispersed like the columns of smoke that once rose above the Belgian forests. But the wisdom behind those signals, the understanding that human knowledge is a continuous stream flowing through generations, that every culture contributes something valuable to our collective survival, that the old ways are not obsolete but merely waiting for the right moment to prove their worth, that wisdom endures. In military academies around the world, instructors still use the story of Joseph Beartrack as a case study in alternative communications and the importance of cultural knowledge in special operations. They teach new generations of soldiers that their most sophisticated electronic equipment may fail precisely when they need it most, and that in such moments they should never dismiss unconventional solutions simply because they seem primitive or outdated. And in quiet homes in Oklahoma and across the Choctaw Nation, families still pass down the old signaling techniques from generation to generation. They do so not because they expect to use them in warfare, but because they understand that this knowledge is part of their heritage, a gift from ancestors who survived against seemingly impossible odds and developed systems of communication that remain viable even in an age of satellites and digital networks. Joseph Beartrack's story reminds us that innovation does not always mean inventing something new. Sometimes the greatest innovation is recognizing the value of something old, adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges, and having the courage to try unconventional approaches when conventional methods fail. The fog that descended on those Belgian forests in December 1944 seemed like a curse to the trapped American soldiers. It blinded them, isolated them, cut them off from the help they desperately needed. But through the smoke signals of a young Choctaw man who had learned the old ways from his grandfather, that same fog became a shield that concealed their communications from the enemy and ultimately contributed to their salvation. What the officers had called primitive superstition turned out to be sophisticated knowledge. What modern military doctrine had dismissed as irrelevant turned out to be life-saving. And what one quiet Native American soldier carried in his memory, taught to him by generations of ancestors, turned out to be exactly what 400 American men needed to survive the most dangerous days of their lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.